Well, we've wrapped up the Gospel of Matthew, and now we're moving on to the Gospel of Luke. And I guess I have to say, Luke is probably my favorite Gospel. If I could teach any one of them, Luke is my favorite. I get to teach all of them, so that's great. But I love Luke, and I'm excited to read Luke with you. This lecture will be an introduction to the Gospel of Luke, looking at very basic information, when it was written, authorship, those sorts of issues. And then we'll also consider the prologue of Luke at the very end of the lecture. When reading the Gospel of Luke, it's important to remember that Luke is only part one of a two-part series. The author of Luke is also the author of Acts. And so there are connections between these. They have common themes. The author of Luke knows he'll be writing the book of Acts, and so these two things kind of fit together, and it's important to keep that in mind when we're reading Luke. So we want to keep our eye on both of them as we read. And I'll point out kind of the basis for this connection when we get to the prologue. Let's talk about authorship for a bit. As we've said with both Mark and Matthew, these Gospels are anonymous. They have been written anonymously. Their names aren't on them when they're written. So when we see the Gospel according to Luke, that's not originally a part of the text. That's added later based on tradition that Luke, the physician and traveling companion with Paul, wrote the Gospel. And so when scholars are looking at that tradition, they're trying to evaluate whether that's a good tradition or not. Is there reason to believe that Luke actually wrote this gospel? The earliest copy with gospel according to Luke doesn't show up until about 175 AD, so it's pretty late. Our traditions about Mark and Matthew are both a bit earlier than that, probably about a good 50 to 60 years earlier than that. Who's Luke? This is a question scholars will ask, and they'll ask, are there reasons to doubt this tradition? Now, I think we talked about this with the Gospel of Mark. If we're looking at the Gospel, and let's say the tradition's not true, right? For the sake of argument, and you were a bishop, and you were looking to make up a name about who wrote this, what kinds of things would you want to be true about the person you made up? Well, you'd want them to be somebody that people cared about, right? You'd want them to be somebody with some authority or somebody people would respect. You want to come up with a name that has some gravitas to it, some clout to it. And so scholars say, well, what about Luke? Is there something would Luke be somebody that would really impress people? Well, the truth is that he doesn't show up in the New Testament very much. He shows up in Philemon, shows up in Colossians, shows up in 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Romans, but all of these are just passing references to Luke greets you, or I send a word from Luke, or say hi to Luke for me, or something like that, right? We know almost nothing about him. So the bottom line is he's not that important. And so some might look at this and say, well, what does somebody gain by making up that Luke wrote this? I mean, if you're coming up with a top 10 list of people you could make up that wrote this gospel, there's a lot of names you'd come up with probably before Luke, right? It's similar with Mark. Mark's not all that significant, so it's probably a lot of names you come up with before you came up with Mark. But there are some complicating factors. And one of those, and probably maybe the most important complicating factor, is a couple of sections in the book of Acts. As you're reading the book of Acts, for the most part, it's written in the third person, right? So they did this, he did this, they did this, then he went here, then they went here, etc. But you get to two different parts of Acts during, I think it's Paul's second missionary journey and maybe his third missionary journey, where all of a sudden it shifts from third person to first person. We arrived here. We then went here. We did this. And so what it implies is that the author was a part of the text, a part of what was going on, right? That the author joined this part of the story. So that impacts who you could create as the author of Luke, doesn't it? So if you were that bishop coming up with names, you'd have to come up with someone who first was a travel companion of Paul. So that shrinks your choice of names significantly. You don't have every name in the early church to choose from. You don't have any of the 12 apostles, right? None of them traveled with Paul. And what about people during those we sections that are actually mentioned, like Timothy or Silas? That couldn't be the author. And so all of a sudden, your group of names that you could choose to write this letter, it has to be a travel companion of Paul. It has to be one not mentioned in those wee sections of Acts. All of a sudden it's shorter. And so the bishop that's coming up with the critic would say, the bishop coming up with a top 10 list might not even have 10 names to draw from. He might only have 3 or 4 names to draw from. And if you only have 3 or 4 names to draw from, Luke looks like a pretty good option. So, with that said, I am not saying that Luke didn't write the Gospel of Luke. It's quite possible Luke did write the Gospel of Luke. I'm just saying there is a possibility. The skeptic could argue, well, the person coming up and making up a tradition didn't have a lot of names to choose from, and Luke was a good one, so maybe Luke was just made up and attributed to this text. Now, I don't know. Either way, I'm not really sure. I tend to think Luke probably wrote it, but there's no way to know for sure. Ultimately, it doesn't undermine the authority of the gospel. The gospel is still a part of the canon, but we don't know for sure who wrote it. What we can say about the author of Luke is that he or she, whoever it might have been, was incredibly educated. The Greek of the Gospel of Luke and of the book of Acts is some of the best Greek in the New Testament. Probably its only equal is the book of Hebrews. Also, as we'll see, the book has an academic prologue. That is a prologue that follows academic conventions that you'd find at the beginning of a significant amount of academic literature in the ancient world. And that would suggest that the person writing it is familiar with the convention because what? They've read a significant amount of academic work. And if it's truly Luke, Paul calls him a physician, which means, at least for his time, he would be quite educated compared to his contemporaries. We know also that the author is either Greek or Hellenistic Jew. The person is not from Palestine. This person knows Greek culture, is familiar with Greek culture, and is not and somebody from Palestine would not know Greek and Greek culture the way the author of Luke does. Now, what this opens the door to is the possibility that the author of Luke just might be a Gentile, and if he is a Gentile, it'd be one of the only books in the New Testament that a Gentile would know a Gentile was the author of. So that's an interesting little detail. Well, what can we say about the date of Luke? When was Luke written? Scholars will like to, if they can, establish an earliest date, an earliest possible date, and a latest possible date. And some factors related to the earliest possible date. Well, one, if Luke and Acts are written together, and Acts ends with Paul in prison in 62, about 62 CE or AD, then that means it has to be written after 62. And then if we say that it's written after Mark, because Mark was a source, well, it's somewhere after 65, 73, somewhere in there. And then also, it looks like Luke is written after the destruction of Jerusalem, which would put it sometime after 70. Okay. And the reason we say this is because of some redaction criticism we can do when we compare Mark to Luke. If you look here, I've given you a passage, I've given you Mark 13:14, and this says, "But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not be, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Well, when we read the parallel text in Luke, the text that is using Mark as a source, look what it does. It says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And what it's done is it's taken this, what is a rather ambiguous reference to a desolating sacrilege. Mark never describes for us what that is. He just says the desolating sacrilege. And it interprets the desolating sacrilege in terms of Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. Right? And then it uses that word desolation and weaves it in there, but it's interpreting for us. And what would that suggest? When was Jerusalem surrounded by armies? Well, it was surrounded by armies in 70 AD by the Romans when it was destroyed. So what seems to be happening here is Luke is looking at Mark and taking a relatively ambiguous reference and interpreting it in light of an event that's already happened that Luke knows about, right? And so Luke has his eye on history as he's redacting Mark. So Luke is almost certainly written after the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, scholars want to say, so the earliest date 70. I would even push it later than that because I think Mark was written in the early 70s. They say the latest date is probably sometime before Paul's letters were collected. Now, why would people say that? Well, Paul's letters were likely collected 100 and started circulating as a group. And at that point, they would have been well known and well established. If they're circulating and they're collected all together, they'd be very famous or pretty well known in the churches at least. And why that matters is because when we read the book of Acts, and we're assuming Luke and Acts are written somewhat close to one another, when we read the book of Acts, there is absolutely not one mention of a letter of Paul's. It doesn't mention one letter of Paul's. And if Paul was known for being a letter writer, and his letters were well known in the church, it'd be very surprising if not one mention of a letter occurred in Acts. And so the assumption is it must be written probably before 100, before Paul's letters were circulating and collected. Okay, and so we have somewhere between 70 and 100. Scholars often will just kind of split that difference and say, well, let's say around 85. It really could be, 5 to 10 years before that or 5 to 10 years after that. We don't know for sure, but somewhere in that window is when the Gospel of Luke was written. What can we say about the audience of the Gospel of Luke? Well, probably the first thing we can say is that it was likely Hellenistic. If this was written in Greek and by someone really familiar with Greek and knows the Greek world, wasn't written by somebody living in Palestine, we can say they were Hellenistically influenced, but then that raises the question, are they Hellenist? Is the audience primarily Hellenistic Jews or are they Hellenistic Gentiles? And there's indications both ways. When you read Luke, there's mentioned a lot of allusions to the Old Testament and references to synagogues. But when you get to Acts, and actually Luke too, there's strong interest in Gentile inclusion. Gentiles being included in the people of God. And so maybe it's Gentile. Most would probably say we're dealing with a group that is kind of a split group, right? A mix of Jew and Gentile. One thing we'd also say is they're likely educated. Right? If you're reading a book that is written in sophisticated Greek with an academic prologue, probably you are expected to be educated to be able to engage that book. And if you're educated in the ancient world, also you are likely wealthy. And so perhaps this is written for a group of Christians that are a little more well off. And expected to circulate among those Christians and be, not that it couldn't be read to other Christians, but likely it was probably written for a more educated audience. Location, we have no idea. There's no early church tradition. Scholars feel pretty there's early church tradition about Mark and Rome. A lot of scholars feel really good about Matthew being written in Syria and maybe Antioch. When it comes to Luke, we just don't know, and all kinds of names have been thrown out there. Right here I have Antioch, Rome, Philippi, but we really don't know. And unlike Mark and Matthew, Luke gives us very little insight into any specific situation it might be addressing, right? Mark, I've argued there's indications that Mark might be addressing Roman political propaganda, and Matthew that is maybe there's this Jewish Gentile or Jewish Christian conflict among Jews. But Luke, we're not really sure, so we don't have a really specific background to read Luke against. I'll really quickly give you an overview of the structure of Luke. Luke begins with a prologue, which we'll look at shortly, and we can learn some interesting things from this prologue. We also have an infancy narratives, birth narratives, and infancy narratives. Not only birth narratives of Jesus, but birth narratives of John the Baptist, which we'll look at closely. There is also a narrative of Jesus as a adolescent, you could say, a boyhood narrative, right? When Jesus is a young adolescent and he's in the temple and he gets left behind in the temple. And maybe this is really the first version of Home Alone. Jesus is left behind, his parents freak out and they find him there talking with the religious authorities there and asking good questions, right? And he tells them, "Didn't you know I need to be in my Father's house?" Then it starts to look a lot like the Gospel of Mark. You have the baptism by John, you have the temptation in the wilderness, you have ministry in Galilee, and a lot of stories from Mark are brought in here. And then you get a really long section. In 950, it talks about Jesus setting his face towards Jerusalem. And then in 1835, Jesus actually gets to Jericho, which is near Jerusalem. And scholars will often call that middle section, there's about 9 chapters in there, that scholars will refer to as Luke's central section or his journey to Jerusalem. The only thing is there's no description of a journey. just a bunch of teaching thrown in there, but there's no actual narrative of him progressing south from Galilee to Jerusalem. He just kind of shows up there and then he's there. And it really is a place where Luke sticks a lot of unique Lucan material and a lot of material that's from Q. And then Jesus shows up. You have his final week, which has a lot of parallels to the Gospel of Mark. Mark's probably the source there. And then you have the Passion narrative of Jesus' death and resurrection. And so it's like Mark, although Luke adds some unique stuff to Mark. I want to look at unique themes in Luke. And the way I want to do this is I want to put up a theme that I see and then show you that theme in Luke. But show you that theme by giving you stories that only show up in Luke's gospel. When you look at things that Luke adds to both Mark and to what you might call Q material, things beyond those two, you see things Luke really is interested in, or when you see ways Luke might redact something, you begin to see things that Luke really cares about. So let's take a look. The first thing we want to look at is God's love for and forgiveness of sinners and outsiders. And so we see a number of stories that promote this. We see Jesus being anointed by a sinful woman. This is in Luke 7:36 through 50. Now, every single gospel has a story of Jesus being anointed by a woman. And the details kind of vary just a little bit in some of them. Some it's his head, some it's his feet. And in 3 of the 4 gospels, there's a story where a woman anoints Jesus. And people are upset at the money she wastes, the expense of the perfume that she anoints Jesus with. But Luke's gospel has a different focus. Luke's gospel tells the story of a woman who's a sinner. In all of the other gospels, the woman is not identified as a sinner, but in Luke's she is. And she comes to where Jesus is eating in the home of Pharisees. And the story introduced you to a Pharisee who lives in the home and is hosting the meal, and to the woman. At the beginning of the story, it's very obvious the woman who is the sinner is the lesser character in the eyes of first century readers. And the Pharisee would be the respected, male, virtuous, righteous, wealthy person. But by the end of the story, the woman is the hero. The sinful woman is the hero, and she is loved by Jesus and forgiven by Jesus. Makes a strong point. There's a parable of the lost coin. We'll look at this parable later, but it's a story of something valuable that is lost. And it's used to talk about God's concern for those who are lost or outsiders. The parable of the prodigal son, perhaps one of the most famous parables in the New Testament. We'll look at it very closely in a bit. But this story too, is about something lost that is valuable to God. The Pharisee and the tax collector is a story of a Pharisee and a tax collector, both standing before God. Now, tax collectors were recognized by Jews as traitors and sinners. And in this, the Pharisee says, "Thank you, God, that you did not make me like this tax collector." And the tax collector beats his chest and says, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And the story says that the tax collector went home justified before God and not the Pharisee. Story of Zacchaeus was an outsider, a tax collector, clearly hated by the people, and Jesus restores him. Jesus from the cross saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," that only shows up in Luke's gospel. And Jesus forgiving one of the thieves on the cross next to him, maybe not a thief, but maybe actually a rebel, a revolutionary. This only happens in Luke's gospel. If you look at these stories Luke adds to the Markan source and to the Q source, you see that Luke is really interested in you seeing something, and that is Luke wants you to see a God who doesn't hate sinners but loves sinners. We're going to expand on this in one of our lectures coming up. The next theme I want to look at is God's concern for the poor and the oppressed, and the way people use their wealth, particularly to help the poor. One particular story that advances this theme is Mary's Magnificat. This is a song that Mary sings after the angel Gabriel tells her she's going to give birth to what will be Israel's Messiah. And the major theme of this song is God raising up the lowly and the powerless and bringing down the powerful. Angels appearing to shepherds. When the angels appear to the shepherds, we usually see this as kind of this happy Christmas story, right? It's part of our nativity scenes that we see. But there's an implied message here that we often miss. Shepherds were considered as a very low value in society, not people of much worth, people that were regarded as kind of irresponsible, maybe shifty, untrustworthy, etc. And what's interesting is when the Messiah is born, when Jesus is born, the angels are not sent to Pharisees, religious leaders, kings, rulers of the people, but what? They're sent to shepherds. People that others would regard as of no account, of not worth much. God sends his messengers to announce to these lowly people Jesus' birth. What does that tell you about God's concern for the poor and the oppressed? You also have Beatitudes and woes. Most people are familiar with the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel, where Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," etc. Right? Blessed are those. What's another one? Blessed are the meek, etc. Luke has these, but Luke changes them. If you go to Luke chapter 6, verse 20, you'll see that Luke changes the Beatitudes and he focuses on physical realities as opposed to spiritual. Where Matthew has blessed are the poor in spirit, Luke has blessed are the poor. Where Matthew says blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, Luke has blessed are those who are hungry. Luke talks about the physical needs of people, and then Luke adds woes to the rich and the wealthy. Now, Luke's point is not that just in the end, God's going to be on the side of the poor and oppose any who have wealth. That's not the point. The point is God is on the side of those who are oppressed by the wealthy. Right? It's kind of this idea of this great reversal in the end when God sets all things right. He's going to lift up the poor and bring down the powerful. Because the idea is that the poor are poor because of the powerful, that the poor are being kept poor, and that God is going to do something to fix that. The parable of the rich fool is an important story. It's a story about a man who stores up treasures, very wealthy, and he has a great harvest, and he has no room in his barns. And so what he says is, I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger barns. And it says that night God comes to him and says, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you. What will then happen to what you've accumulated?" And the point of the story isn't just that you can't take it with you, although that's part of the story, right? Storing up for yourself treasure here isn't very valuable. But the idea is what? What should he have done when he had all this excess wealth? He should have shared it, right? Shared it with people in need. He had more than he needed. With the extra, he could have given it away and helped people. That's the point. Then there's a statement about who to invite for dinner, right? Jesus says, when you invite people to dinner, don't invite the wealthy. Don't invite those who can repay you. Invite the poor. Invite those who are disabled. Invite those who can't do anything to pay you back, and then God will reward you for your generosity. It's also the parable of the great banquet. It comes right after who to invite to dinner. And Jesus tells a parable where God essentially invites to his great banquet the outsider, the poor, the disabled, those not recognized as valuable in society. Then you have a parable of the dishonest manager. And as you'll see, this is going to have something to do with caring for the poor too. I'll say more later. The parable of Lazarus and the rich man, again, a parable that has a lot to do with caring for the poor. But again, we're going to focus on these stories a bit more later. So when you see all these stories that really emphasize on caring for the poor, you realize Luke is trying to tell you something. Luke thinks this is really important. He doesn't want you to miss this. God is a God who's on the side of the poor. And if you are part of the people of God, he wants you to be on the side of the poor as well. The next thing I want to look at is God's concern for women. And remember earlier in this class, I talked about the negative portrayal of women, how ancient Greeks and ancient Jews saw women as much less than men in value, how they blamed women for sin, how Aristotle saw women as incomplete human beings, all these very negative things. But what's interesting is when you read Luke, you see that Luke gives women prominent places in the gospel and shows Jesus' concern for them and care for them and shows that they're elevated and shown to be important and significant. even as important and significant in men in many places. And that's a powerful statement in a first century culture. Again, you might not read Luke's gospel today and say, wow, Luke's such a feminist. But if you were reading Luke in the first century, you'd be struck by how Luke elevates the place of women. So let me give you examples. Elizabeth and Mary. In the opening story of Jesus' birth, Elizabeth and Mary play prominent roles. Elizabeth is the mother of John the Baptist. Mary is going to be the mother of Jesus. When you read the birth narrative in Matthew's gospel, Joseph plays a more prominent role than Mary, but in Luke, it's Mary that gets the attention. And it's interesting, Luke tells stories of John the Baptist's birth and Jesus' birth. And he kind of contrasts two characters. Elizabeth's husband is Zachariah. He's a priest, a respected priest, and said to be a righteous priest. And Zachariah is encountered when he's in the temple by an angel, and the angel promises Zachariah that he is going to have a son. Now, Elizabeth and Zachariah are really old, so this is virtually impossible. And he promises him he's going to have a son, and the son's going to be great. And Zachariah says, how will I know this is going to be true? He wants a sign as proof that what the angel is saying is true. And he gets this kind of ironic sign. He's mute. He's not able to speak until the baby is born, and he gives the name of the baby that the angel gave to him. And then he can speak. So you have this man presented with this extreme situation where he'll have a child and he doesn't have faith. And in the very next story, you get Mary, who is unmarried, is a virgin, thus impossible for her to have children, and an angel tells her that she's going to have a child. And Mary responds differently than Zachariah. She does not ask for a sign, and she says, may it be to me as the Lord has said. Do you see the contrast? We often look at these stories and we think in terms of, we just think we're just reading the facts, right? Just the details. But do you understand what the author's doing? He's putting two character stories in contrast to one another, side by side, two parallel stories. In one, it's a righteous, virtuous Jewish man who's a priest, and what? He fails. But the insignificant, young, unmarried woman without children at this time, what? She would be not valued in her society, but she succeeds where the man fails. Do you see what Luke's doing? He's elevating Mary. He's saying, look at this woman who is a paragon of virtue and faithfulness to Yahweh. She out-faithfuls what? The priest. Luke's trying to tell you something about the woman there. Anna the prophetess, this is a woman who's been essentially living in the temple for a long time, since she's been widowed by her husband for years and years, and she's been waiting God's Messiah, and when she sees Jesus, she recognizes him as the Messiah. The raising of a widow's son, this is a story where a widow loses her only son, and Jesus has compassion on the widow and raises the widow's son. The point being that if you were a widow, you don't have a husband, obviously, and if you lost your only son, no one's there to care for you. Jesus sees her plight, reaches out, heals her son, so that the widow will be able to go on living. The anointing of the sinful woman. Remember, we already talked about this story, but this one is, again, the woman was a sinful, but she was also a woman, right? So this advances the same theme. Women who take care of Jesus and are disciples of Jesus. There are women here that travel with Jesus and take care of the needs financially of the group that follows him. And these are female disciples. Rabbis in the first century didn't have female disciples, but Jesus did. That's important. The story of Mary and Martha. This is a story of two women who followed Jesus. And in this story, Mary is presented as sitting at the feet of Jesus, learning from him. She takes on the disposition of a disciple, learning from a rabbi. That's a pretty unique thing to see in the ancient world. A disabled woman, where Jesus says, woman, thou art loosed, and she's bent over, but now she's able to walk. Jesus heals her. And the story of the persistent widow, this is a story Jesus tells. It's essentially a parable, but it's a story of a widow who goes to a judge. And the judge won't find in her favor. He's a wicked judge. He's an unrighteous judge. And justice would say you do what the answer in the widow's favor, but he won't do it. And she goes again and again and again and again. And it says because she was persistent, essentially she drives him crazy. And finally he gives in. And the story is an example of prayer. It says how much more would a righteous God respond to your persistence than a wicked judge? Right? So the idea is being persistent in prayer, but who does Jesus use in his example? He uses a marginalized widow woman. If you see these stories in Luke over and over again, Luke adding stories about these women to show their virtue, their faithfulness, that's saying something. Luke wants you to see that God is concerned with women, that God sees women as righteous and virtuous disciples, people that are just as important as men in the kingdom of God. This is important, and Luke wants you to see that. The next theme I want to look at is called universal salvation. Now, by universal salvation, I don't mean salvation necessarily to everyone. What I mean is salvation not just for the Jews. That God's salvation, that God putting heaven and earth together again, is not just a blessing that God is doing for the Jews, but it's for all people. And Luke emphasizes this through many little details and stories. There is a man named Simeon that's been waiting also for the Messiah. He's closely associated with Anna the prophetess in the story of Jesus' infancy. And he says that Jesus will be a light for revelation to the Gentiles, meaning through Jesus, Gentiles will see God and come to follow God. Jesus' genealogy, we talked about in Matthew how the genealogy of Matthew goes back to Abraham, who is the father of the Jews. But Luke's genealogy goes back to Adam, who is the father of all humanity, right, in the Jewish story. Oh, that was kind of fun. Let's do that again. Oh, it didn't work. Well, never mind. Jesus' sermon at Nazareth. Jesus takes a story of Jesus, or Luke takes a story of Jesus preaching at Nazareth, and he takes it and puts it in a very prominent place in his gospel, and he adds to it because it happens in Mark and it happens in Matthew, but it's a very short story and it's expanded in Luke. And the story has to, and Jesus is telling about the messianic blessings he's going to bring, but then he indicates that those blessings will go to non-Jews. And when he does this, the people want to kill him. Luke adds to this story this idea of the message of God and the message of Jesus going to non-Jews. It's not there in Mark. It's not there in Matthew. Sending out of 72. When you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, every one of them has a sending out of the 12. But only Luke has a second sending, a sending out of the 72. Now, 12 is a symbolic number. It symbolizes Israel. Right? And that the gospel is being sent out to the Jews, sent out to Israel. But Luke adds a second sending of 72. In the ancient world, there was this idea that there were 70 or 72. The numbers vary, and sometimes in Luke, manuscripts of Luke, you get 70, and sometimes you get 72. But the idea is that this is a representative number of the nations of the world. And so Luke has a sending out of the 12, which represents the gospel going to Jews, but he also has a sending out of the 72, which represents the gospel going to Gentiles. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, Samaritans were enemies of the Jews. They hated the Jews. And in this story, Jesus depicts a Samaritan as a neighbor to a Jew and presents the Samaritan as righteous and virtuous, where a priest and a Levite fail to be that. This is a story that is trying to emphasize God's inclusion of non-Jews. And the cleansing of 10 lepers. The cleansing of 10 lepers, we have lepers that are outsiders because of their leprosy. But what's interesting about this story is 10 are healed and 1 returns to say thank you. Jesus sends the 10 to go show the priest that they don't have leprosy anymore. Only 1 comes back to say thank you to Jesus. And the interesting thing about that 1 is he is a Samaritan, right? And this is indicating the Samaritan is an example of one who faithfully responds to Jesus in a way that the others do not. It's indicating the inclusion of non-Jews. Some other Lucan themes to note. One are prayer and praise. Luke likes to emphasize prayer. Oftentimes important things in the life of Jesus he places in the context of prayer. He also has a number of little praise songs. Now, you can't tell they're necessarily songs when you read them in English, but if you read them in the original language, you'd get the song part of them. Mary's Magnificat, Simeon has a little song. There's all these little different songs. I think Zechariah sings a song of praise to God. The Holy Spirit plays a prominent role in Luke's gospel. And Luke also wants to emphasize continuity between Jesus and the Old Testament. Luke is trying to establish that the story of Jesus is not some new thing that God's doing, but a continuation of the old thing that God did. And what can we say about Luke's presentation of Jesus? Well, one, he presents Jesus as the compassionate Messiah. Compassionate on the weak, compassionate on the outsider, compassionate on women, compassionate towards the ostracized and the marginalized, right? Jesus is the forgiver of sins. Jesus is presented powerfully as one who forgives sinners and reflects a God who loves sinners. Jesus is a powerful prophet, very much like Elijah and Elisha, but more than a prophet, greater than them, doing more and better things than they did. Again, Jesus is a friend of sinners and outcasts. And Jesus is a universal Savior, not only for Jews, but Gentiles and Samaritans as well.